It's great to see you all here, and I hope you'll kind of be ready with questions and comments once we've heard from our panellists here, because we want this very much to be kind of part, you involved in this as much as us here up here. My name's Roanne Dods. I'm a co-producer with Jerry Hassan of the ImagiNation Festival, and I'm really thrilled to have our 4 guests here tonight. We've lost Alex Massey, who's really unwell, I'm afraid, today, but I'm thrilled that Catherine Trebek has agreed to stand in at the very last minute. So I think that's very impressive. And what we're going to do is we'll go through, each of them will speak for 5 to 7 minutes or so on their subject area. As you know, the theme is Scotland Radical, which is, of course, got lots of questions implied in that, which I hope we'll kind of tease out during the course of the discussion. And we'll start with Rachel Edgar, who is the chair of the Equality Network, and has been, amongst other things, a civil servant working with young people, and a lawyer, and is a consultant at the moment with many interests. So we'll hear from her first, and then we'll go on. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, thanks very much. Can people hear me okay? Yes. Okay, well, thanks for inviting me along tonight, Jerry and Roanne, and thanks for that introduction. So tonight's question is whether Scotland is more radical and politically progressive than the rest of the United Kingdom. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. From my own experience in employment law and equality, I suppose I can point to examples. I think in employment law there's a general sort of consensus in Scotland that the employment tribunal fees are unreasonable, and a desire that became part of the Smith Commission recommendations to allow those to be devolved so that they could be removed. In equality law, I could argue that the equal marriage legislation in Scotland, I think, is more progressive than that down south, particularly when it comes to the rights of transsexual people. So I'm sure we could all point to people, to organisations and to institutions that are more progressive and radical in Scotland, but I think we could also probably point to many that are far from radical or progressive. And I think the same has to be true if you look across the border to England. We can point to very positive examples, we can point to much more negative ones. So I guess I'm wary of becoming fixated by those sort of comparisons. If we decide that we are more radical and progressive than south of the border, what does that actually mean? Does it mean that we risk becoming complacent? Oh, we're so much better than you guys, we can just sit back, not a lot to do, relax. So to me, I think the more interesting question, and sorry for not answering the question I'm invited to do, is how do we make Scotland a radical progressive country? How do we make Scotland the country that we want it to be? How do we build on that increased political engagement we've had over the last couple of years? Are we content just to go back to voting every year or two in an election or in a referendum, maybe signing the odd petition to say we don't like something, and then leave the rest to politicians? Or alternatively, in an increasingly connected world, do we risk becoming overwhelmed by the number of issues, at local, national and international issues that we could engage on? We've got something to say, it seems wrong. How do we engage in a way that we are actually able to make a difference? Because I fear that in this increasingly engaged world, we're being bombarded by issues. I don't know about you, but in my inbox every day there's a petition to sign on this or that, and Facebook I see things, on Twitter I see them. How do we actually decide how to engage politically and do it in a way that's meaningful? And I suppose how do we ensure that what we do has an impact, and how do we make sure that both at an individual level and collectively we can actually maximise that impact? Let me give an example of 2 issues that are important to me. The first is, how do we create a society in which we can maintain dignity and well-being as we grow older? How do we ensure that older people can avoid isolation, can feel safe and secure, and can maintain independence as long as possible. The second issue, how do we create a society in which children grow up free of sexism? I was struck, I never know quite how to characterise this one, because I think it is quite challenging, but just in the last week I've been struck by a few things. One is watching Eurovision, which obviously is the way to learn all you need to know about sexism, and seeing that to be a presenter from any country, if you're female, you pretty much have to have a top that's plunging down here. So this is a bit wrong. You have to take out all this fabric. And a skirt that probably was about here. If I want to walk down the red carpet at Cannes, obviously, these shoes are far too flat, I wouldn't be able to do that. And then, these seem frivolous, but I think it becomes much more insidious when you also look at how the main access to information about sex for teenagers now seems to be pornography, rather than any kind of sex education programme in schools. I would argue that these two issues are an example of the kind of issues that are just too big to be dealt with by politicians alone. And that's why I think we need to look at how we can engage. And I have a few thoughts about how we face these and other challenges, and maybe we can explore them a bit more in discussion later. So my thoughts are, one, focus. There is so much going on. I think we have to decide, where can we make a difference? Where can you make a difference? Do you prefer small-scale local engagement, or do you prefer national campaigns? Can you organise support for an elderly neighbour, or can you campaign about benefits for carers? Two, I think it's absolutely important that we believe change is possible. There are few more effective ways to defeat change than cynicism. It'll never change, there's no point, it won't make a difference, they're all the same. It certainly won't change if we don't actually try to make it happen. Three, I'd invite people to consider what you can do face to face. Can you encourage a neighbour to become involved in a local campaign? Can you persuade a colleague to join a union? I still think it's easier to influence people face to face. We often seem to find it easier to understand other people's viewpoints when we're standing right in front of them or sitting right in front of them. By contrast, you can spend many hours on Facebook or Twitter or writing comments on web pages and blogs without any evidence you've done anything to improve understanding or find common ground. Four, I'd say take advantage, that didn't go down well. Okay, it's really important. Four, take advantage of opportunities. One of the achievements of the Scottish Parliament has been to make politicians and civil servants much more accessible. If you represent a relevant organisation, it's not hard to join a parliamentary cross-party group. MPs and MSPs all hold surgeries, and if you're the constituent, you can go along. If you're part of an organisation, there's a good chance that your local MP or MSPs will come and see you if you invite them, especially when there's an election coming up. Five, at least occasionally be the person who's different. Go somewhere you're not supposed to be and are perhaps not comfortable. Challenge stereotypes. And six, perhaps most importantly, do something. Make that difference. Thank you.
Yes, I like the discussion on, yes, meaningful ways to influence, and that's brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Andrew Tickell, who is known to more of us as Alala's peaked warrior on Twitter, and who's a blogger and commentator and and a lawyer, as I will hear from him now.
I'm a lawyer. Did you see that?
Which actually I am too, and Rachel.
I was going to say, I was given assurances that I was the only bastard on this panel, but there seems to be several of us up here. Sorry, I just interrupted your introduction.
Not at all.
Well, hello, thank you all for coming. As I said, I am a lawyer, and I think I'm here to persuade you of something that would be very straightforward, which is that law is not necessarily a source of radicalism in Scottish life. Think for a moment, what do you imagine when you imagine a Scottish judge, a Scottish lawyer? You imagine someone slightly more perjink than me, probably, with probably wearing a marvellous coat on top of it, and a sort of very nice Edinburgh education, and all of these kinds of things. And actually, the history of Scots law has not been one of radicalism. Scots law has lagged behind England plenty in terms of really important rights and fundamental freedoms that we all now enjoy. And I'm not sure that's something we can all be terribly proud of. Just give you a few wee examples of that. Until 2010, if the police lifted you, because you're a suspicious looking character, and there are a number of people in the room that are a wee bit suspicious looking, if they lifted you, you'd be questioned without a lawyer. In England, you had the right to that since 1980. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not reassured by that. Until 1990, men in the room, you were entitled to rape your wives. So that's something to really feel proud about Scottish life. That was what marriage meant in Scotland until 1990. Take gay rights, for example, another great Scottish triumph. The Wolfenden Report came out in England, which liberalised the laws of England on sodomy, buggery and all these exciting offences. In Scotland, when was it? 1967 in England. Scotland, we got there 1980. Oops, took a wee while. I think that the lessons of Scottish recent history are not necessarily great ones, but you pointed to some lovely examples where things are altering, things are changing. And to some extent, the vision we have, I think, of lawyers these days, the old crusty, grog-blossomed, reactionary bastard who sits in the Court of Session sending people down and enjoys having people hanged, that's some way behind us. Now we have different challenges. We have challenges of commercialisation, challenges that only rich people get access to justice, challenges which are reflected in the fact that in the Scotland Act of 1998, your basic rights, your fundamental ECHR freedoms are enshrined. You have a right to liberty, you have a right to privacy, you have a right to property and to family and to free expression. And all that's great in principle. But ask yourself, who since devolution has used this legislation? I don't know if you know, but it's not very high up the public agenda. But it's Imperial Tobacco who used their right to property to challenge the idea that we shouldn't peddle nicotine to children. I saw that just recently that, I think a big tobacco American corporations launched a massive suit to argue that we're fiddling with their trademarks, their right to property. Shocking, shocking, these fundamental freedoms being used in this way by corporations. We have AXA, that great band of insurers that tried to prevent those whose lungs had been scarred by being exposed to asbestos from accessing any kind of recompense on the basis of their right to property. They have a right to property and your lungs, I'm terribly sorry sir, your constricted breathing is very concerning, but we're off to the Court of Session because we have human rights too. That is the lesson to some extent of access to justice in Scotland in recent times. People who want to hunt little foxes have pursued them through the courts as well. They didn't win in the end, but they spent a significant amount of time, public money, pursuing these legal challenges. The law empowers generally people who are wealthy, people who have access to counsel, people who have access to power. And in modern Scotland, that is as much of a problem as it has ever been, perhaps more so now than it has been before. I must say the Scottish Government, they're doing better than the government in the UK. The UK government have basically retreated. They've abandoned families to their legal disputes with no counsel. It was a horrific case, break your heart, of a couple of who were of limited intelligence, who the state was taking proceedings to take their kid off them. And under the legal aid rules in England, they had no lawyer. Neither party had access to somebody who had the nearest, foggiest clue what the case was about. And well, what does that matter? It's only their kid that you're taking off them. That's inconsequential. That's where we are with law and access to justice in this country. And I think one of my anxieties about radical Scotland, if you like, and the idea of challenging these ideas, I'm sure most people in the room will find what I just said pretty horrific. But access to justice, legal aid is so far down the agenda, it isn't true. It's the quiet budget where cuts are experienced individually and budget reductions are experienced as a very big figure on a generally pressurised budget for the Scottish Government. Now, I don't blame the Scottish Government for that, it's not their choice, but it's the reality of where we are now. And I think for me, one of the really interesting things is that the referendum and subsequently we see a kind of growth of what I think you were talking about, which is active citizenship, of people saying, listen, I'm not going necessarily to law, I'm going to organise ourselves, I'm not going to basically leave the gatekeepers, the QCs, the politicians, we're going to take it to them and argue our own points and form our own movements. I find that an inspiring and I think more realistic way of achieving political ends in Scotland today, that if we're going to be serious about these things, whatever your views actually, radicalism of the right, radicalism of the left, self-organisation is, I think, the way forward, because basically we can't afford any other kind of political activity. So I think the copy sheet for Scots law is not great. We've got a whole history behind us, and a brighter history perhaps before us. But if we feel empowered, if we feel that you and I, all of us together, strangers, can get to know one another and actually make a case, make the arguments, challenge these fairly flimsy vested interests, then I think we can roll them all before us. So that's my point of view. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. I've got lots of questions from that, but that's really, really great. Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Jackie Erdman, who's an Equalities Manager at the NHS. Thank you, Jackie.
Good evening. Well, inevitably I'm going to start off talking a little bit about health, but I would also like to talk about some other things, gender equality in particular, community development, and just the whole idea of identity. So, is Scotland a radical country, a progressive country? Well, it goes without saying that it is definitely an unequal country in terms of wealth and health. And one of the events which I went to, which Jerry had actually organised before the referendum, Danny Dorling came up to speak to us, and he does these wonderful maps of the UK, and basically said, yes, whatever the vote is, you are inheriting a very unequal country. I won't bombard you with statistics, but basically that inequality comes out in terms of life expectancy. So if you live in Jordan Hill, you will live, well, almost 14 years longer than if you live in the East End of Glasgow. And I did realise after I put my talk together, this is a very Glasgow-orientated talk, but that really is my experience of Glasgow. So in a way I'm really saying, is Glasgow a radical city as much as is Scotland a radical country? And what is the cause of that? Well, obviously poverty and unemployment, and the whole kind of history of Glasgow in terms of what's happened in employment. And that there's a whole debate, which I'm sure we might come back to later in the evening, about the Glasgow effect and the Scottish effect. So why is it that people have poorer life expectancy? And that is actually across the whole social gradient. In Scotland, and particularly in Glasgow, and it does have a lot, I think, to do with our history of employment and deindustrialisation, but it's also extremely complex, and there are lots and lots of reasons, and probably we will never actually know one single reason why that is the case. But I suppose the question is, what have we done to tackle that inequality within the existing powers that we have? So have we used them in a radical way? So we do have a lot of funding in Scotland in the public sector. So have we redistributed that funding? Well, sadly, no, we haven't. So, for instance, there's a movement called the GPs at the Deep End in Glasgow, and most of them, they talk about the 100 most deprived practices in Scotland, most of which are in Glasgow. But we have a flat distribution of GPs, so we are all allocated a GP per head of population rather than by need. And you can imagine the politics of trying to change that, how difficult it would be to change that. And of course we talk about levelling up, not levelling down, but it would be very unpopular, I think, to try and change that distribution of GPs, because inevitably people would say, you're taking away a service from me to give it to somebody else, and I'm not very happy about that. And I suppose just in general what we've done is we've individualised health and illness. So there's decades of research on health inequality, but at the end of the day it still comes down to the individual, the choices you've made, you're the smoker, you're not the smoker. So that, despite all the evidence on the structural root of these problems, the answer is always very individualised, and I think that is a very big issue. So in health policy terms, are we different? We're certainly not radical, but we are different in some ways. So we have things like the drink drive limit, the smoking ban, which came early in Scotland, free personal care, free prescriptions. But in contrast, we have things like private dentistry, we have socially determined health outcomes, and the balance between prevention of ill health and treatment is entirely skewed towards technical and medical solutions. And again, that would be a very hard thing to change. But I mean, things like waiting times. So we can reduce waiting times. Nobody wants to wait long for an operation. But actually doing that in itself will not reduce health inequality. In fact, it will probably widen health inequality. So that kind of universalism that health has is its strength and its weakness in a way. So we have a universal system which we know tackles inequality in one sense, but in another sense it's all about who can get the best access to that healthcare, and the people who get the best access are the middle class. And that is the situation that we have. I just wanted to talk a little bit about gender equality. Again, I think this ties into the difference between Glasgow and Scotland and the Glasgow effect, as it's called. And Scotland was much slower than the rest of the UK in terms of women's economic activity. So the economic activity rate for married women was 2/3 of that of the rest of Britain, and it really only caught up in the 1970s. And the reason it caught up was because men were joining the dole queues because of high unemployment. I was going to use a personal example. I've lived all over Scotland, but I was living in Skye when my brother was born. So I was, I think, about 4 when he was born. And my mum was a teacher, and she wanted to go back to work. So she put an advert in the Poetry Times, I don't know what it was called, looking for a childminder. And a woman duly turned up at the door. And my mum thought this was somebody coming to find out about the job, but she'd actually come from the church to tell my mum the evils of going back to work and leaving a young child. So you can imagine how that went out. Yeah, it's quite a story, isn't it? But it really happened. I don't think my mum liked Skye very much. But anyway, just in terms of gender equality, we see daily institutional and family violence towards women and children, and you've used an example of that, I think. That's obviously not a Scottish phenomenon. We also have institutional violence, I would say, in our prison population, where really the underlying issue is often child sexual abuse and certainly mental health problems. So none of these things are particular to Scotland. However, what I would say is that having lived and worked in Glasgow for about 40 years, I think the women's movement in Glasgow was quite radical. The women's health movement, the whole movement on feminist economics, the stance that Glasgow took on prostitution and in terms of tackling gender-based violence, things like mobile creches, women's centres. Again, these are not entirely Scottish things, but I do think there was radicalism there, and I think it's really important that we do remember that. But I think it was contrasted with, you know, a very kind of macho, unionised movement, and I think that women have struggled with that as well. So there's been some brilliant campaigns in terms of women equal pay and so on, but I think the union movement has not always been on the side of women. Just a couple of other points. My partner said after 3 minutes that everybody would start getting bored, so I will talk quickly. Thanks. I know that's very supportive, but so I will rattle on. But I did want to just talk a little bit about community development and the voluntary sector. And I was saying to you earlier that I do have a habit of choosing professions which more or less immediately go out of business. So as you know, community work in Glasgow was thriving when I started my career in the early 80s, but it has more or less disappeared now. And I think that although community action is alive and well, and I mean this venue is an example of that, but that community development approach I think has gone over the years, and I think the voluntary sector, as we speak, is really fighting for survival, fighting for funds, and of course community action itself is very gendered. But again, I think there was a radical approach, and I think this gives us some hope, called the Social Strategy for the 80s, which was Strathclyde Regional Council, and I sound like a right dinosaur when I talking about this, but in a sense it was radical, and I think what was radical was Strathclyde was big enough to redistribute money, and it was accepted that more money would be spent in Glasgow than Dunoon. Now, people in Dunoon didn't like it, but they accepted it, so we did at that point win the argument that we should use our money in a different way. And the other thing that was radical about it was that every council worker was a community development worker. So whether you were a janitor in a school, or whether you were, like myself, actually called a community development worker, your job was to empower the people you worked with, to listen to them. you hear terms like person-centred care now, but that was a radical approach. And of course, what happened to it? Thatcher killed it as quickly as she could. It was threatening, people were organising, and I think it was an extremely threatening thing that she had to get rid of. Oh, by the way, I now work in equality, and the Human Rights Act is now under threat, so I better choose my next job carefully. I just wanted to finally end on the issue of identity, and just, you know, what does it mean being Scottish? So, are we radical? But what does Scottishness mean as well? And I think it's really complicated. I feel intensely Scottish, but I moved around as a child a lot. I lived in Skye, born in Dundee, lived all over Scotland. But because I moved around a lot, I was always the incomer. So I feel Scottish, but I feel not Scottish. The other thing is that, on top of that, being gay, I've been an incomer to the straight world. So another form of identity which I've struggled with. But then also, having been previously married and having 2 children, I was an incomer to the gay community. So I've always been on that kind of strange, outside-in kind of look. I can tell you, experiencing the second wave of the Section 28 campaign in Glasgow was quite scary. My children were going to a school where other children were wearing badges against gay people. And that was difficult, caused a lot of discussion in the home, as you can imagine. And I think that campaign was funded by Brian Souter. I wonder what else he's funded. So yes, more radical. Well, I think I agree with you that thinking that we're more radical in a way makes us more radical, or at least it opens up the space and the possibility for radicalism, and I think that's really important. And personally, I like living in a country that even thinks it's more radical. I would like it to put its money where its mouth is, but at least we are prepared to talk about it.
Thank you very much. That's a really uplifting way to kind of end that bit of your talk. And I hope, and what I'd love to hear actually is just be listening before we go on to Catherine, is if when we kind of open up the discussion, you have any examples of where there are really good radical organisations, fledgling or not, or old examples, it would be really great to just kind of hear them too. So our last speaker, Catherine Trebek, who's a global policy researcher at Oxfam, I'm really grateful to have coming along today, so thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
So a pleasure, though up until about 5:32 I should have been sitting amongst you in the audience, and then I made the schoolboy error of answering a text from Jerry that said, help, someone's sick. Can you stand up? So I'm afraid I don't have anything nearly as sort of well thought out and articulate or as sort of logically flowing as the other 3 speakers, but I do have a few points that have just been sort of sparked in my mind by the sort of question around, are we radical, and perhaps do we even want to be, do we need to be? And when I sort of phoned up Jerry and said, really, do I have to? and this discussion about, I was just coming on to have a quiet drink and listen. He said, really think about the work I've been doing around the world, around working with colleagues in Brazil and South Africa and India, places like that, around, does radical change happen? Are there examples that we could point to? And reflecting on that, and that question of, can we point to places where radical changes happen? I mean, actually, the answer is yes, and pretty much everywhere. And let's start at home. I mean, we've seen huge shifts in the last 30 years, where we had that sort of post-war Keynesian Beveridge consent settlement, where in most of the graphs that we care to look at, things like inequality, labour versus profit share, level of environmental legislation, things like working hours, the link between GDP and things like the genuine progress indicator, all those sort of graphs were trending in loosely the right direction. And then up until, and you can look at this, up until sort of the 70s, they all started tracking in a different direction. And in the space of 30 years, we've massively shifted how we set up the economy, the sort of collective institutions that we once established to look after each other, they've been very quickly, and I think at an accelerating pace, decimated. So that is radical change, not in certainly in any direction that we want to, but we're now treating people, I use this phrase, where people are no longer sort of human beings with intrinsic value, they are just-in-time inventory for businesses. And you need not to look no further than zero-hour contracts, just to see how businesses click their fingers, just like a pallet of paper. There are some employees, oh, we don't need you at the moment, off you go, you're away. But also, we're no longer communities, we're clusters of consumers. And also the environment is no longer something of with intrinsic value, something to be cherished for itself, but it's something from which we suck resources as another input into the production process. And that's extraordinary change. And I'd like to think that because we've gone in one direction, we can most certainly take action to pull back, and I'm really hoping that's what we'll get from the discussion. But beyond our shores, in places like Brazil, that has gone from one of the most unequal countries, and you've probably all seen that photo of the sort of high-rise flat with all the beautiful sort of swimming pools right up next to one of the favelas in Sao Paulo. So it's gone from this sort of iconic, unequal country with its terrible history of a military dictatorship to now the poster child of participatory democracy. They've taken massive steps. Of course it's not perfect, so let's not claim anything's perfect here, but if we step back from looking for perfection, then we can see some really interesting examples. And yes, of course, participatory budgeting that you've probably all heard about, but really interesting activities opening up community councils with real control around health budgets, an initiative around public prosecutors, an office that's really there to stand up for citizens' rights, to the point that now my colleagues are complaining of social justice through legislation rather than just through movement building and things happening naturally. But also the huge decline in inequality that is happening in Brazil through initiatives like Bolsa Familia, which is conditional cash transfers, not really radical in itself, but when you're coming from nothing it is. But Bolsa Familia is dwarfed in its impact by increasing the minimum wage and formalisation of the labour market. And so Brazil's seen massive changes in some of those really important poverty, absolute poverty, and they're heading towards zero hunger. So that's really exciting. But just the other side of the continent, places like Ecuador, and I think there's some really inspiring stuff happening that if we just turn our gaze away from that sort of romantic Nordic space and look at Latin America, some really exciting stuff happening there, where Ecuador, under President Rafael Correa, has said, development is no longer about accumulation. It's not just increases in GDP. It's more than that. And what they've enshrined in a new constitution is this principle for good life, bon vivre. And bound up in that constitution, they've become the first country in the world to put the rights of nature in a constitution. Now, I mean, if that doesn't excite you about written constitutions, then there's no hope for you. But also they've done things like self-government for indigenous communities, which, in a country like Ecuador is profoundly important. Focusing on local development, endogenous-led growth, rather than this sort of mantra that I'm so sick of hearing here, of export-led growth. We can't even pay our people enough, it seems here, that they're the sources of demand. We've got to send it off to consumers around the world. But Ecuador, in its constitution, is saying it's all about local development, rather than trying to sell to the world. They're guaranteeing dignified work, and they're guaranteeing protection of public spaces. Now, in the constitution, now you only have to compare that to some of the trajectory that we're seeing in just this city here, where we've got a consumer consumption-led economy, and we're seeing public spaces where it's free to just hang out, encroached upon, that sort of privatisation of the public sphere, to just see how we need to raise our gaze and look at places like Ecuador. So that's one point. Like, yes, radical change is happening, it's happening everywhere. Another thing that has sprung to mind as I was walking here is that nation-state as a unit of analysis is a red herring. So if we're looking for change, we need to look beyond the nation-state. Now, there's a guy, a cultural theorist called Frederick Jameson, you've probably heard this quote. He said, it seems to be easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I have to say, we see the evidence of that in what's being put forward by pretty much all mainstream political parties, including up here. It all seems to be about sort of understanding, yes, maybe put a bit of a fuzzy face on capitalism, but that's as far as we get, rather than changing the structure of ownership and making it much more democratic. And then if you look at where is the really exciting action in terms of policy and change, where do we look for the sort of change that we can do an economy that delivers first and foremost for people and planet? It's certainly not the nation state. The chinks of light, the really inspiring examples, they're happening in communities across this country and across the world. They're happening in cities. They're happening in some really progressive companies. There are companies that are saying we're no longer going to report every quarter because that's pushing us into a short-termism that's toxic. So investors, shove it. We're going to push back on that quarterly reporting. So there's some really interesting stuff happening at corporate level as well, but then also this movement around what I call, it's not very sexy, pro-social business models. So there's exciting change happening there too. So things like this growth of cooperatives or community interest companies, and we're sitting in one of those here today. And even in some of the, dare I say, supranational organisations. I mean, the World Bank is publishing some pretty powerful statistics about the extent of fossil fuel subsidies, which ranks in the trillions of dollars. And then who pays them? Nation states. So who is missing from this party of people moving towards better, more people and planet orientated changes? Nation states are missing. And so there's a conversation that'd be really nice to have about what's broken with our democracy and how useful that left-right framing is in pushing beyond where the nation state is taking us. And my final point, really briefly, is that purpose is key. Repurposing the economy, repurposing our business, that's how we'll get proper, really exciting, radical change, but also repurposing at the level of the government and what we want, what we see our government is existing to do. Now, I think to a great extent, Scotland can take pride in its elevation, rhetorically at least, and again, there's another point of conversation, but the rhetoric is there around social justice, around democratic renewal, around equality, and we've got world-leading climate change legislation. And if you don't want to be proud of that, let me just contrast that with a comment made by the foreign minister of my home country, Australia, a woman called Julie Bishop, and she said, and this is around a plan to dump toxics into the Great Barrier Reef. She said, we are not prepared to sacrifice our economy on the altar of climate change. So contrast that, and again, that's a pretty radical shift, to living in this small country here with world-leading climate change legislation. So I think we can sit back and pat ourselves on the back a little bit. And if you look at something fairly dull and policy wonky, but around the National Performance Framework, which in lieu of a written constitution is potentially one of the most exciting documents of government, there is some really constructive conversation going on between government and civil society to broaden out that document so it's not just dominated by GDP, which I'm fairly critical of as being sort of blind to distribution and orientated to consumption. So by no means is Scotland perfect, but we will only head ourselves into corners if we're seeking perfection. What we need to seek is much more inspiration and chinks of light. But what makes me hopeful, as my colleagues here have said, is that this idea of wanting to be radical, telling ourselves that we're not perfect, but perhaps let's aim for that, then I think we'll continue to improve. And that, I think, is real cause for hope. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That's 4 fantastic stimulations. I prefer that word into provocation, but it's probably not quite the right word. But so lots and lots of areas and ideas for thought, but also some threads of similarity around kind of the storytelling aspect of it. The sort of stories that we're telling ourselves and how important that is in terms of how we can frame our thinking and then start to, as Kat was saying, shed light on those that are doing the kind of the the progressive, the radical, the pioneering work that we need. So I'm sure there's loads of ways into this conversation, so I'd love to open it up. We've got about 40 minutes or so of conversation, so I'd love to hear sort of questions, comments, ideas that come from that. So yes, we'll start off. Thank you.
There are a number of homegrown political organisations that obviously define themselves as radical, with obviously the Scottish Left project, which I find up today. They seem to be talking about a different kind of radicalism to the stuff that we've had tonight. So I guess my question is, are they barking up the wrong tree?
Would you like to, could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by the different kind of radicalism, just in terms of...
You're talking about things like community
Yeah.
activities and sort of face-to-face contact, which are still fortunate for us. There seems to still be a lot of talk from me.
In those organisations, yeah. Is that something that you're able to want to comment on?
Well, it's probably, I mean, in terms of what does radicalism mean, I suppose we've been extremely cautious and cowardly perhaps in our definitions of it. Many people would say they know what radicalism is, and it means something straightforward and left-wing and agitated, and I thought what my gender is really important. I mean, well, exactly, it's angry orange men on stages shouting at you, not naming any names. And I think that's a bit of a problem, the idea that we all know what radicalism is and that it's owned by somebody. Thatcher is radical. I think Scottish politics is full of this nonsense. We go, are you in favour of social justice? Said, and who answers no to that? Who's against social justice? I think one of the things that I've enjoyed about this recent debate we've had in Scotland is it's been very engaging, but it's also been extremely stupid much of the time, and encouraged people to think they agree with each other much more than they do. If you think, I'm progressive, well, bully for you, but Ian Duncan Smith thinks that he's in favour of social justice too. He's got a different vision of it than you, perhaps, or maybe the same as some of you, different from me, certainly. But I think in Scotland we're not really used to talking about things which are complex in public. And therefore we tend to give in to emotional manipulation and straightforward sloganising. And I can understand why, because that's fun. It's fun to be part of a tribe. But it's nonsense. And I think to treat radicalism as if we all knew what it meant is to treat us like numpties whose heads button up backwards. That's my cheerful message.
Very cheerful.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does come back to what a couple of people said about the kind of frightening efficiency of the right in terms of being radical. And I think, I can't remember Naomi Klein's word for it, but just being very, very effective at using disasters in times of change to bring about very negative radical change. And I don't know, you start to get a kind of conspiracy feeling that, you know, there's some way that the Borg of the right all communicates about how to do this. And whereas the left feels fragmented and, you know, people, you know, there's a almost sort of to the point of infighting. Some of the students that I spoke to that, actually this is another good example, but the students that took over the building on Glasgow University, I can't remember the name of it, it was a postgraduate, postgraduate club, Hetherington, that's the one. A couple of people that were there were saying to me what was really good about it was it forced all the left-wing groups into one building, and they had to get on with each other. They had to have discussions, you know, probably about who was going to clean the toilets and stuff like that, but they also had to have political discussions and thrash things out. So that was a really nice example, I thought, of especially young people being radical, and it was really exciting. But yeah, so I don't know if, you know, can we learn something from the right? Am I actually saying that? But they were very, very effective, especially that, as you say, that whole idea now that we can't get rid of capitalism. You know, so nobody's standing up and saying capitalism's the problem, what are we going to do about it? I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's interesting.
Yes, that's really interesting. Any you want to come back on that? Because I think the question of what is radical, I think, is fundamental to this discussion. Before I came out, I told my son what I was doing, and he said, what the theme was, and he just said, "But what exactly do you mean by radical? I can't even think about this question." What do you mean? He's 12.
He's a promising lawyer. I was going to say.
Yes.
Pick up what you said, Gore Vidal's claims was obviously capitalism, but we're still doing. And that network you're talking about, that chink of light phrase, it fills me with dread because it's such a wonderful phrase. But capitalism creates the networks of oppression, power against us. Call it land rights. I immediately think of fracking.
Yeah.
And all the licenses were going ahead, nobody knew the licenses were even being applied for. Then neighbours find out when one of the nicest belts in England is happening right in their quiet door. But it's still happening. And there were lots of diverse, attention was being put everywhere else except on the licenses, applications. So on the one hand you've got great chinks of light, and on the other hand they're covering up the light just as quickly and putting damp cloths on the searchlights. It's very worrying to me. And very enlightening what you're saying, but I think the idealist approach was beware of the powers and what appears to be, you can't help noticing the reality of what you're reading. If you read more in-depth magazines, if you have a brain and a power to think logically and follow arguments, there's an awful lot of darkness in it. And we have to really raise ourselves up and get way beyond the parapet, and that parapet's very bad. It's just,
No, I absolutely. Have you got responses to that? I was going to say.
I'd just be interested to know what the audience thinks about the Green movement and the Green Party, and whether there's something there, whether that's where the new radicalism is going to come from. Question to you.
Yeah. I was just going to say, the chinks of light was more, I think, as about finding those examples where people are actually kind of addressing these things, and you're absolutely right about that all happening kind of behind, which is where I think really, lawyers that are prepared to work differently could have an influence, because we need them in those sorts of situations. And also then today, the Ferret was launched, which is a new, which I love the name, which is a new kind of open-sourced approach to investigative journalism, which I think which is new to Scotland. So I think it's those sorts of things. It's those sorts of things that will start to help address. So they've actually asked the public they chose the 3 top stories that they want to investigate, and they've asked the public which they think are the most important, and fracking is one of them. So.
But justice is boring, isn't it, basically? I'm an extremely boring person, and I'm quite exercised by very boring things. And the truth is that the high rhetoric of radicalism and big political ideas come down to small places close to home. They come down to licenses and subsection 2, subsection 3b of an act that no one would possibly want to hear about. And I think that connecting up those two things about the reality and the tedium of justice is something which actually we're not really prepared for, because we want to be inspired. We don't want to talk about subsection 3b. And I think these tensions, I think one of the problems is we talk about game in Scotland, but we're actually strangely indifferent to actual decisions. To give you one example that's really wound me up. Today, the Scottish Parliament voted against even considering beyond the general principles of assisted suicide. Totally off the public debate. Didn't exist. And we get more of a damn about Alistair Carmichael and the lies he may or may not have told, which are all good fun. But no one is going to risk prosecutions. No one's life is going to be destroyed but Alistair Carmichael's by his fibs and fictions, and we don't seem to give a damn. So I think the point, licensing, justice and licensing, how's that for an inspirational message?
And I think just coming back to your point about new political parties, I think there is a whole territory of debate that we're just not been having. We've just had a general election where there was almost no discussion about foreign policy whatsoever, other than whether or not we should leave the EU. So there's massive territories, as you said, that aren't even being discussed at the moment, and I would see new political parties as one of the ways, hopefully, to broaden that discussion.
So I might just stand up for the lawyers.
Because you're not one as well, are you?
No, goodness no. No, but my training's political science, and having just read Naomi Klein's recent book, I mean, I spent 3 years researching how, at a glance, very, very disempowered communities in remote parts of Australia could confront massive mining companies. And 9 times out of 10, they fell back on the legal system and were able to really creatively use those rights to challenge these big dominant economic entities. Naomi's client's book, all the chinks of light in Naomi Klein's book of resistance against fracking or against sort of corporate big massive dams or against sort of the Indian reserves in America having to give up their land for oil or for a train full of explosive fuel to drive through their land. Almost every single one, the law was all they had. And so I've sort of got this growing appreciation. And again, the example I gave of Ecuador, rights of nature being enshrined in Constitution, how's that going to be upheld? Through the courts. And so, we've got nothing if we don't have a really powerful, robust legal system. So I mean, just as a reflection that I have this sort of newfound love of how law can be a tool for social justice, but I think comes back to Andrew's point around the sort of I guess the word, I don't know what to use around legal aid, but the sort of massacre of legal aid, that has profound implications of who's going to be able to access those arms of justice that may be there in theory but won't be there in practice.
Hi, thank you to the speakers. Really enjoyed the contributions. I'd like to start just by saying the way the question's posed about whether we're more radical than other people or whatever, I think it's kind of slightly provocative, but I think it's helpful because at one level it doesn't matter about how radical we were in the past, but it's important to understand if we think we're more radical than we really are, what psychologically is going on in the country. Because Section 28, not only was there a campaign, there was a referendum, informal and unconstitutional, within which 75% of the Scottish population voted to keep structural discrimination against lesbian and gay people, and that was only 10, 15 years ago. So you can answer that question simply by saying, well, if we're more radical than everybody else, then pity everybody else.